All right, we are in Hebrews chapter 8. We've made a ton of progress. We got through chapter 6 and 7, and we're in 8. And we're right now in the thick of why Jesus is better. And last week we looked at some things about regarding how God had made an oath that that the Messiah would be the priest, and so there was this better aspect of him in that sense. And we looked at how he was blameless and sinless, and which was pretty incredible, contrasting with the Levitical. I'm going to say Levitical now instead of the Aaronic or Aaronic priests. He's better in that way. There was a few other ways that we looked at it, but we're gonna switch a little bit. And we started last week just getting into this, and we're gonna switch a little bit into this idea that the law and the Levitical priests were just a shadow of heaven and what is going on there, which I think is pretty interesting. So let's read. Let's see. Dad, would you mind reading Hebrews 8, 1 through 5?
1 through 5. Okay.
Yeah.
This is from one of those liberal translations. It's called the Living Bible. Here we go. Here's the main point. Our high priest sat down in a place of the highest honor in heaven, at God's right hand. There he ministers in the sacred tent, the true place of worship that was built by the Lord and not by human hands. And since every high priest is required to offer gifts and sacrifices, our high priest must make an offering too. If he were here on earth, he would not even be a priest, since there already are priests who offer gifts required by the laws of Moses. They serve in place of worship that is only a copy, a shadow of the real one in heaven. For when Moses was getting ready to build the tabernacle, God gave him this warning: be sure that you make everything according to the design I have shown you here on the mountain.
All right. So that was fun. That was very different than what mine says. Not
It was.
just slightly different words, I should say, different words, but same meaning.
Well,
So
I
we're
got
all
the
good.
King James here too, so I can switch back.
So that's good. So before we start, we talked about verse 1 some, verse 1 and 2. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna get into verse 3 today. But before we get into verse 3, I think we need to take a close look at verse 5, because I think this is the principle that we need to apply as we go through these verses. And this will help us, at least when I was reading and studying and looking at verse 5 and the other verses in context of this, I was like, oh wow, there's some interesting things here that I hadn't really thought of before, and it's just interesting. So verse 5, he says, who served the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. So there's this idea here that all of the law and the things of the priest and the things that the ceremonies that the Levites are doing and all of this stuff, these are shadows and patterns after what is happening in reality of heaven, what is happening in heaven. They're just pictures. And I think this is really interesting. We're going to see when we get through verse 3, there's this interesting thing that happens here. But we just want to catch that as we're going through here. The law is a pattern and a shadow of heaven and what's going on in heaven. And we talked a little bit last week. I mentioned the solar eclipse because we just briefly hit on shadow and what that is and what that means. But just so we're all on the same page, when we're talking about shadow, right, this is when something is blocking the light. And when it blocks the light, you see the shadow, you can see the outline of the thing that's blocking the light. And so that's something that I want us to take a look at. This is really cool. When, for example, if you were to go get what's called a shadow portrait, you might see them hanging on people's wall, and they will sit in front of a light, and their shadow will be projected on a wall or something, and they'll draw an outline of it and make that a profile of the person. So it's like a picture, but all you're seeing is the outline of the person. And so what you're actually looking at when you see a shadow, it is the absence of something. And I think that's really interesting. You're seeing what's there by seeing what's not there. And I know, how does that make sense? But that's what's going on, right? You see something, you can get a outline of something based on what is missing. And that's what we look at when we're seeing a shadow. And the other thing about a shadow is we might get a outline, we might kind of understand what we're seeing, but you can also skew it, right? Sometimes if you go outside and you look at your shadow, depending on where the sun's at, you can be super tall according to your shadow because it's skewed the thing. And so you're not necessarily accurately seeing what you're looking at, but you are getting an idea. You are getting a pattern and a picture. And that's one of those things where we have to be careful about, because if the law is the pattern, we could shift things in a way and skew things in a way where we're focused on an aspect which it isn't nearly necessarily as prominent as it is in reality. And so what we want to do is look at the reality. And so this is all just really interesting. I think this is interesting. The whole idea that you can learn about something by looking at what's missing, I think that's an interesting idea myself. But that's what we're doing. That's what a shadow is. And that's what the law is, right? That's what he's telling us. The law, the Levitical ceremonies, all of these things, the priesthood, these are all shadows and copies and pictures. And I mean, the words that he used was shadows, copies, patterns. These are what we're looking at. Anybody have any comment before we jump into verse 3?
Well, just thinking about shadows, I started thinking about shadow puppets and how the shadow might look like one thing, but be entirely different if you saw what was actually casting the shadow.
Yeah, for
I wonder
sure,
if
right?
there's any.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wonder if there's any shadows in heaven from the glory of God shining on us, or if
And
that's the temporary fact of the shadow is no more. It's not necessary anymore.
yeah, it's an interesting question. Does the energy of the God's glory penetrate through what we consider physical objects? I've wondered about this too. And if you read in Revelation, you actually see that a lot of the building structures are made out of gems and rocks that are transparent to some degree. So the light even if the light can't penetrate physical like what we're used to, it still would penetrate the buildings. It's all very interesting. I
Have
don't
you
know. It's a good
have you
question.
seen several years ago I came across this video about when you shine light into the gems that those structures were made out of, the light that would actually come from them versus if you shone the light at diamonds and stuff like that, it would actually cast a different light and make it dark. And so I'll see if I could find that. It was actually really interesting when they
Yeah.
started shining lights through those different gems and whatnot. I thought maybe you guys may have come across it, but I'm gonna find that, Jones.
Does
Yeah, I
anybody
would love
know
to.
any scripture references on Christ's resurrected body if it cast a shadow? I can't recall, but I might be missing.
No, and you have to be careful on
It
that.
it
I know
I
it's
light
just
light
suspect it's
it's the source of light is one way I would.
yeah.
yeah.
But also we
I guess,
see
guys, I will step in a little. I mean, I'm saying I'm not awake. My brain is mush, and sometimes that's a good thing. But I don't. Our mind naturally is going to trying to imagine what heaven's like, but I look at this as a shadow of the cross. There may be some indication that I don't even know that he's trying to project imagine heaven by this shadow. Rather, I think this is when he talks, the phrase in verse 5 of the NASB is shadow of heavenly things,
Hmm.
not necessarily
Yeah,
heaven, right? And so,
that's right.
okay, and so my brain doesn't even go there. Although I think it's cool to think about these shadows in heaven. Instead of chains, maybe you got shadows following you around. Sorry, but no, I just don't even. The idea that the tabernacle is some image or shadow of something in heaven doesn't compute with me. So,
But I mean, but
but it
that's
also is
exactly the
something
reference
of
he
my,
makes.
say again.
That's actually the exact reference that he makes, though. He points out in Moses, he's saying, God says to Moses, "You make this according to the pattern of this," and the author is saying, and that's a pattern. He's making the tabernacle, an earthly thing, literally in the pattern to represent some aspect of heaven.
But, and this is, I'm not sure I'm being clear. I
Okay.
don't think it's a physical analogy. I think it's purely a cross analogy. Now I'm only trying to clarify the point. I'm not saying
Yeah.
this is it. Again, I'm
So
not dogmatic about these, but I don't, the notion that it's on earth it looks like this, and heaven it looks like this. No, at this time it looks like this, and but what we're really talking about here is the cross. And there's other reasons why I think that. It's because, when you look at
yeah,
what's happening in a tabernacle, it's food prep, it's butcher shop,
yeah,
it's yes, the presence of God, but it's something else entirely that doesn't exist in the future. It's all done with Christ and completed.
yeah,
So all the
yeah,
activities around the cross are gone, because it's all, I'm sorry, I'm not in the tabernacle, are gone. It's all on the cross. And
If,
so I think I've made my point. That's all I'm trying to do.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not
yeah,
trying to
yeah.
convince. Yes.
I'm with you. I
Mhm.
don't know that I would limit it to just the cross, but I'm catching what you're saying. Actually,
Okay.
this is a good lead in for verse 3. So let's look at verse 3 and we'll continue this conversation. It says, verse 3, it says, "For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Therefore, it is necessary that this one also has something to offer." And again, I'm just pointing out this verse in light of verse 5. What he's saying here is that the priests offer these sacrifices, they do these ceremonies, but they're just pictures and copies and shadows of what's really happening, of reality. And as Eric mentioned, the cross is the big thing, right? When we say that the priests are offering sacrifices, Jesus also offers sacrifice of himself. But there's a difference here, and one of the biggest difference is that the priestly sacrifice of the Levites, they had to do it all the time, right? It was not really sufficient. They had to keep doing it. The sacrifice that Jesus provided as himself, that was done once, and that covered all time, past, present, future. It covered everything. And so there's this different sacrifice that he made that is better. It is the reality, whereas the Levitical sacrifices are just a shadow and a copy. Which leads me to a question. Did the Levitical uh, sacrifices, did it provide atonement? Did it provide reconciliation with God? What do you think?
Um,
I think it was,
again, it was a representation of the sacrifice that needed to be done for everything.
Yeah.
I honestly believe that because he sacrificed that animal that one time a year for the Jews, that it didn't give them any, it was just in remembrance, I think, of what is going to happen. Just as we do the same thing, the Lord's Supper. It's in remembrance of what Christ did for us, dying on the cross. I don't think that it gave them, okay, you got one day of, your you're reprieved for one day. Let's start over again. I think this is what needed to happen in order to be saved, so that when Christ did do the final sacrifice, it meant so much more to the Jewish people.
I'd say is a good placeholder or a nice little practice for the big day. And if they didn't have practice in sacrifice and rituals and understand what sacrificing meant and the point of it, then what was the point of Jesus? It'd just be, oh, that guy did that thing, right? But if they understood what sacrifice is, why they did it, why we atone, and then this guy comes on and does it for everybody, then it just really shows what a grand plan this was and what a great sacrifice that he made.
Wow. Well said.
Yeah, much better way to put it. Thank you.
I mean, it was temporary atonement, right?
Well, that's what I'm asking.
I think it was. I mean, it says it. If you read it, it was temporary. It was atonement, right? I mean, they did it periodically, right? It had to be done, and always it asks me the question, what do the Jews believe in today? Because it's obviously not happening. Peter would have a field day, but it's
I don't think they're worried about PETA, but I
no,
think
but I'm
what-
just saying, why aren't we doing it? Why don't the Jews do
Yeah.
it today? That
Yeah.
there was nothing that happened in their world to change that, because they don't acknowledge Jesus Christ as
right,
that
so they
sacrifice.
should be doing it.
They should
Yeah.
be doing it. Why isn't it happening? Because it
Yeah.
was required.
So if you
And-
look at the, with the scripture reference in regards to Abraham's bosom, so they weren't saved, but there was atonement there. They were in, basically paradise, but they weren't actually saved by the blood of Christ until that happened. So they were
Yeah, yeah.
more or less in a holding place of paradise. I don't know what that. I mean, you can get it from the description that it was fantastic, and then the person, Lazarus, the rich man on the other side, was in misery. So you can kind of that is some type of atonement, but they as being saved and covered by Christ's blood, no.
Yeah.
It's
I-
interesting because you're right. It wasn't salvation, right? But God said, do these things or be cursed.
Right.
Yeah.
And if
So
you
it's
look
interesting.
at if you
I
look
have
at
a question about sacrifice. I know that people offered different sacrifices based on their financial ability to pay. That there were substitutes if you could not afford the appropriate sacrifice. Were there different sacrifices for the different sins?
right.
And most of them, and I find it very hard to track Leviticus and others, although I do enjoy it. It's most of it was for unintentional sins, and there was no provision for paying for intentional sins, as far as I could see, in any
There
of
was
the
death.
sacrifices. Pardon?
There was death, but
There was just no. It was all for. And it's just an interesting thing. It was truly for unintentional sins, and then on top of that, you had sacrificial ones, which was for the presence of dedications and things like that, and office commissions. But there is no, I murdered somebody intentionally. There was no atonement for that in any of the rites and rituals.
According to Leviticus, there kind of was, because
I
you
don't-
had to
okay.
die.
Pardon?
That's what I'm saying. You had to die. The atonement was death.
Oh.
That's what I'm saying. It was
Actually,
not a
that's
good
perfect.
atonement.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
So
An
the
eye for
question,
an eye.
the question I always ponder is: was the thief on the cross? Did he have atonement, or did he have salvation? Since Christ was not technically, he was not resurrected when he gave that promise, and he said, "You will be with me in paradise,"
Yeah.
which would place him in with the atoned Jews and the atoned people who of the Old Testament, but not necessarily saved until he accepted Christ's resurrection after it happened.
Yeah. I mean, we could speculate a lot of
Right.
this. This is really interesting. But I think the main point we want to get out of here is if you focus too much on the Levitical sacrifice, it's going to lead you down the wrong place because it's a copy and it's a shadow. If you think you have to perform a ceremony in a specific manner with a specific priest doing whatever, it's not necessarily, it's just a shadow, it's a copy. That's not what is providing atonement. It's not what's providing salvation, even if you want to say that it does, really, the salvation comes from the fact that you are putting your trust in God and that He is going to do what He said He was going to do. And what we're seeing here is it's a copy of what's happening in heaven, and what actually happens in heaven is what provides salvation. And so it's just this real cool thing that we want to understand is that if we get too stuck in the details of the shadow, we can get lost. Instead, we want to go and look to the reality, which is Jesus. It is the cross. There's the real salvation. There's where we find our hope. And even back in the Old Testament, if they were putting their trust in God through that sacrifice, they're still in a manner putting their trust in the reality, in the heavenly thing that's happening, because they're just saying, God, I don't know exactly how this works, but I'm putting my trust that you are taking care of it. So there's just this cool aspect here that it covers all of these situations, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting in the sense that we are. That's why the New Testament focuses so much more on grace and mercy
Yeah.
than it is on works. And that's what, a lot of religions, being brought up as a Catholic, I had to go to confession every Saturday and make up for the sins for the whole week, and all those other things before I could take communion. I couldn't get communion if I hadn't done confession the day before. But what if I sinned after I did confession? All those things come into play, and
Yeah.
it's not about works, and that's really what the sacrifices here are that we're looking at in Leviticus. It's about you have to do these works. You can't do this. You can't do that. You have to do this. It's all about how do we do it, and we in a lot of churches have their own works that you have to
Yeah.
do.
I mean,
help-
Jesus pointed a lot of that out. I mean, it's superficial, right? And he pointed it out because really he pointed out that it was the heart that mattered, right? You could do all these things, but if your heart's not right, and so that was what all these priests and all those council leaders, whatever, I mean, their hearts weren't right. They did all the superficial, but the hearts weren't right. And so like you're saying, is in our faith today, right? We need to be careful, right? That our hearts are right. We can go through and do all these, we can show up, right? And look the part. But if our heart is not right, then we're no different, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. All right, let's look at verse 4. It says, "For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law." That's an interesting thing to say, right? If Jesus were here on earth, he would not be a priest. Why do you think that he wouldn't be a priest if he was here on earth?
Because we already
Not
have
from the line of
priests.
Levi.
That job's already taken by a few people. Jesus was different. Jesus was
Yeah.
something that has never been, never before, never will be again. I could think know about 7 or 8 priests or pastors in my, I only
Yeah.
know one Jesus. Or I'm getting to know him a lot better. That's what I'll say. I don't know him, but I want to know.
And this is cool because this also points out why Jesus is better, right? He is a priest who's in heaven versus the Levitical priests they are here on earth. Jesus has access to God. He's a much better mediator because he's actually there in the presence of God, whereas we have these earthly priests who are in the presence of us and maybe get to go into the Holy of Holies and be in the presence of God. But you can see there's a big difference between where they are and how they can mediate. So it's just a good picture to point out that if Jesus was here, he would it wouldn't be anything special then. He would just be here on earth. But because he's in heaven, he can do that mediation for us on a much better degree than he could do here on earth. Any thoughts?
Well, you're speaking straight to the source as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not like that game of popcorn where the message isn't always clear, or yeah, you have to do this and then I'll pass that along to my boss. You know what I mean? You're talking directly
Yeah.
to the man in charge. So that's always nice to know.
Yeah.
It's a weird one. I'm not.
You know, it's,
This is one of those weird phrases that I think is
I agree.
somewhat mysterious.
Well,
I
when
agree.
he was,
And I'm.
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, when he was on Earth, he wasn't a priest, right? He was a carpenter. He was,
Yeah.
he was, so I mean, you kind of look at it from that. His example is he wasn't a priest when he was here on Earth.
He was a lamb. But at the same time, I don't know what this phrase is still saying.
I do agree with you. It does feel like we're missing something here. But
Well, I don't know if you remember, I just listened to Brian's message on Easter from Easter morning. There was a poem he read at the end about Jesus, and I can't remember it all verbatim, but it kind of explained his whole life out. And he never owned anything, and the only item he owned, they cast lots for it to buy it, so, and that was his garment, and forsaken by all. So I wonder if that kind of plays into what the statement is here, what he's saying here.
so do we know when Hebrews was written?
some people put it pretty early. Possibly before the other writings of Paul. I'm sorry, before the writings of Paul, but somewhere
Because,
around that time.
I just looked it up. There hasn't been a high priest since the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
There is no high priest today. So it's interesting that, if he was on earth, he wouldn't be a high priest because there is no high priest because the temple was destroyed.
Yeah.
So I think that's
So a
kind
lot of people actually think Hebrews was written before that incident because he never actually references the destruction of the temple. So there's this idea that this is probably written before that because he's talking so much about the priests and he's mentioning the tabernacle a lot and the temple that you would think that if it had been destroyed, he'd mention that. But this is, I don't, maybe. All right. Now we're back to verse 5. We are just on a roll here. Verse 5, it says, who served the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, see that you make all things according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain. So we talked some about verse 5 because we wanted to see all of this in the context of that the Levitical law, the law itself is all a copy and a pattern and a shadow of reality, of the reality of Jesus and heaven and the things that are going on there. And so we're looking at that, but I just want to point out a couple of other things here, which one really important thing that I want to point out here is that this is not man's idea. And this is an important thing to understand and to grapple. I'm looking for a word. Grok, that's the word. And that is that God is the one who gave Moses the law and told him about these things. Man themselves did not come up with the law, right? We may have understood internally and naturally some aspects of the law because God may have imprinted that on our hearts, but we did not. Mankind did not come up with the law. It was not that mankind said, okay, sin is bad, so we're going to do sacrifices and that'll take care of it. It was God who said, sin is bad, and so you're going to do sacrifice because that's the only way I will atone and I will find it acceptable. And so we just want to recognize that it is God who has done it, that man did not discover the law, man did not come and figure it out. It was all through revelation of God. It was all God saying, no, here is a pattern and a copy that you guys can look to. It is interesting. It is God that provided this shadow to help us to see things better. And because he knows, right? We can't go into his presence and be with him physically because we just can't withstand that because of our rebellion against him. So he gave us this law to help us to understand who he is, help us to understand his heart. And so there's this important point here that it is God who ordained the law and who revealed it to us. And the reason I'm bringing this up here is because there are plenty of people who, and there's even a movement called progressive Christians, where they have come to this point where they are going to change the rules of God. They're going to change the law and say, well, this doesn't really apply anymore. That was kind of more culturally for that particular time, and we're not culturally in that time, so we're going to shift and make these things. But the point that we're making here is we don't get to do that. This was all revealed to Moses from God. He's the one who determines what is real. We don't get to say, hey, this is a shadow and copy of things are real, so I'm going to define what is real and change the shadow and copy to match it. If we do, really what we're doing is we're saying we are God. We are putting ourselves in that exalted position because it is only him who gets to tell us, to reveal to us what heaven is like. I thought that was really interesting. I don't know what do you guys think about this, but I just really like this idea that Moses didn't come up with all of these things. He didn't build the tabernacle in the way of his own idea. It was all given to him as a pattern from God. You guys have any thoughts about that?
Could I read a verse? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think God gives us a pattern for everything in our life. And I think when we follow God's plan and his pattern and his design, things go very well for us. And I think it's when people start deviating from God's design and start making their own little plans is when things start going astray. That's all.
I think also the cool thing about it is it's about God, not about us. And he created it. It's his design, and you didn't create it. You were just a workman. You could be a part of it. You might be able to put your signature at the bottom of the credits, but at the top of the credits is going to say God. In the middle of the credits is going to say God, and a lot more God. And I mean, he might include you. I mean, again, I think it's an honor when he includes us and have a pattern for us. And I think when you start to think about how Moses got that, it was like, wow, you picked me to kind of oversee this. And then, he inspired others to have specific talents to build that. And it is like, oh my gosh, like, who am I that you would select me to be a part of such a grand thing? And it goes right back to him. So it's kind of interesting how God does that. It's almost like a trick. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna get you to do this, and you think you're going to get all the honor, but in reality, I'm getting all the glory as part of my miraculous plan, which is awesome.
I hope you're in a parking lot or a stoplight because you stared at the camera this entire time, and I hope you're right.
Okay.
Can
I read a verse? Can I read a verse real quick?
Sure, Doug, go for it.
Yeah. So John 18. You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is out everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And then this is him talking to Pilate. Pilate responds. Pilate said to him, "What is truth?"
Yeah.
And so I think that summarizes, it doesn't matter. There's the world and there's Jesus and God. Jesus is the truth. And those that know the truth know him. Right? They're just, and so man can do whatever he wants to do and spin any truth he wants to spin. But at the end of the day, there's one truth.
Yeah.
And it's Jesus. Anyways, that was
Oh,
good point
it
you
is,
had
it is.
touched on.
I love that whole thing. I love how Jesus says, I came to testify the truth. It's the reality. It's reality that he wants us to point to, and we can easily get caught up in the lies and in the shadows, and we still just need to be reminded, no, we gotta go back to what is real, who Jesus really is, who God really is. All right. Then let's read the next verse. So this is verse 6. Excuse me. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. Oh man. So this is going to lead into the next section, which we're not going to have enough time to just get into all of this stuff. But he does bring it up here. So what do you think is a better covenant? I'm tempted to go into the next step.
Well, all right, so
Grace.
during this, I get these feelings that something is just ungraspable in this for me at the moment, at this time, as you guys have been talking. It's the intensity of the cross is what's overwhelming me right now. It's
The better covenant would be that Christ's death paid for it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah,
once
and that's
and for
it.
all.
The new
That's-
covenant and the covenants with Jews and Gentiles.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, we bandy some words around like atonement and salvation, and again, I don't think heavenly places or things. I think the cross still, it's what's, I keep getting pulled back to it, that it's what is it all about? We had the
Yeah.
garden, we had that brief moment in time in the Bible that's mentioned where they were walking with God, and they weren't walking around sacrificing things and doing rituals and even worshiping. Now, granted, Revelation, I do set it aside for a moment, but it was a presence with God, and that better covenant. Yes, okay, we have a covenant here in believing in Jesus Christ, but we're at peace with God again. We're reconciled to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is so profound,
Yeah.
and it's what all the law was about, and the cross is about. So this can go in so many directions, but at the center of everything is the cross, and so I'm
Yeah.
stuck on that.
So because of some of the things that you brought up, we're talking about a better covenant and better promises, right? Established on better promises. And I to me, this brings in the picture of Abraham, who gets that first covenant, right? And that whole covenant picture is really interesting. We don't have the time to go through all of the amazing things where God walks through. And just to be clear, a covenant is a contract where you cut up. It was actually called cutting a covenant. You cut up a whole bunch of animals and you walk between them. And the idea is, if you don't fulfill your side of the contract, you can be cut up like these animals. You can do to that person like you're doing to them. And so there's this cool picture of Abraham. And if you look at the promises that were given to Abraham, they're cool, but they're very earthly, right? There is the promise that the nations would be blessed because of him, that God told him that he would make a name for him. God told him that he would get to have the land. God told him a promise that he would be a great nation. There's all of these promises that were given to Abraham, which are very temporal and very location based. And it's very interesting. The promises that we have are much better, because the promise we have is that we get to be in relationship with God. We get to have access with him. We get to have access to him and be with him and know him in a way that we couldn't because of our sin. But God covered that and made that promise. And then there's the other aspect of the better covenant where Jesus actually did die, right? He did actually sacrifice himself. So it's, in a sense, it's like you couldn't handle your side of the covenant, so he's going to take that punishment for himself so that everything is still reconciled, everything is still good, and we get to have that relationship with him. And I think, Eric, what you're saying is it's it's hitting it right on, which is the main better promise. There's a lot of promises that we have, but I think the main better promise we have is that we have access and intimate knowledge of God in a way that we couldn't before. And I think that's really cool. I don't know what you guys think.
That word in there, mediator, I think is key. You know, if you remember back in Job, that was one of Job's. It wasn't just a request. He was pleading with God to have a mediator between man and God. And here we see that Christ is that mediator. And I can just imagine Job looking down when Christ is here going, man, you guys don't realize what you have. I had to deal with God directly, and I had to I was cowering in fear, but you have this person that can be between you and God and take the brunt and take the questions and be there for you.
Yeah. And there's also the aspect of, hey, if my mediator is God, does he even understand me? He's God, I'm man. And here we have Jesus, who's like, no, he was also man. He can fit in that perfect place because he can understand us. It's all fantastic. I love it.
There are some just words, you have the intensity of the cross, but when you bring Job and what you were describing there, Tim, it brings in the dissipation of all the intensity at the cross.
Right. And I mean,
Beautiful.
God, you know, he came down on Job, and rightly so, because Job did what he did. And I mean, I can't imagine having the full, well, maybe just a little bit of the brunt of God coming down on me. That would just be unimaginable.
When you talk about the new covenant, you also talk about the veil being torn from top to bottom, not bottom from top, but
Yeah.
the top to bottom, which means that has been open to us, which is remarkable for me because of the cross and because of who Christ is and what he's done for us, that we have direct access on a daily, moment by moment time. We have direct access to God the Father through Christ being our mediator and him taking the brunt of our sins. I think to me, that's the new covenant, because on every other one, it was, you had to have somebody between that. And now Christ is our mediator, or our Moses, or our high priest. And that's the cool part for me, is that we have direct access to God the Father through Jesus Christ.
I used to review contracts as part of my job. And, you know, when you revise the terms, it never arrives in a way that's favorable to you. It's sort of who started it. It's always more favorable to them. And the person gets to review it and, you know, argue the terms. And then eventually you arrive, hopefully, at a place where you can agree, this is fair, this is whatever. But, you know, once in a while you'll get things where is just such an amazing deal in every way, right? And you just have to compare the two. You know, what are the terms? Who are the parties involved? Where does all the liability, the fulfillment, all of that, you know, who does it lay with? Because at the end of the day, that's what you're looking at. It's like, what do I have to do versus what you have to do to make this work? And what do I get out of this, right? Because that's the idea. And I think you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Covenant, New Covenant. I mean, in every way, we talked about it already, and we can ponder this forever, which we will. 'Cause I think when we get to heaven, the wonders of the cross are going to be so overwhelming that that's going to be the core by which we worship God for all the glory that he deserves. I think it all centers on that. And we've yet to understand the depth of what that is until we come face to face with God, I think. So it's really cool. But in every way, I mean, to encapsulate what you were saying, John, I think in every way, just compare it line by line if you want, break it up whatever way you want as far as the contract between us and God and what we have to do versus what we get, and there's no comparison.
Yeah.
I was
And
thinking
we don't
about-
even understand all the things we get, right? It's amazing. It's
Yeah,
eternal.
the you know, the fine print is good for us.
Yeah.
I don't think we've begun to understand, you know, because usually again, contracts, you know, the fine print is what they hide the sort of different things, but in this case, the fine print sort of is really interesting. There is no fine print in the sense that it's harmful for us, but it's sort of God saying there's so much more here that you don't even begin to understand
Yeah.
what's coming.
Well, the old covenant, the priest was a sinner himself, and so he had to atone for himself and the people. But with the new one, Jesus was sinless. So I think of it like, if I'm going to get something clean and the person that I'm giving it to clean it is dirty, then how clean is it really going to get? Versus giving it to someone that's sparkling spotless, obviously, you know, it's going to come back a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we're going to have to stop here instead of jumping into verse 7 through 13, where he talks about some of this new covenant, and there will be more where we'll go over it. But this is all I'm really liking this. I know for a long time, for several weeks, I was struggling with the fact that he seems to be repeating himself. And I'll be honest, we'll come and we'll have the discussion, and I'll be like, God, you were totally there. You brought this out. There's so many amazing things that I wasn't catching, and it seems to be we're in a fresh new area as well. He just never ceases to amaze us. So I'm looking forward to this discussion on the new covenant.
We'll be sure to cover half a verse next week then.